So, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone. Again, I'm Ada Estrada, Dean of Global Education for the Community Colleges of Spokane. I'm excited that you all have joined us today for the last session of Intercultural Week series that focus on promoting diversity, equity, and global awareness. Thank you again for joining the presentation on America, Higher Ed, and the World by Honorable Ryan Crocker in collaboration with the Intercultural Week Committee. I will be helping moderate today's session. And before we begin, I have a couple of very brief housekeeping items to review with the audience. First, all attendees are currently on listening only mode. However, as you know, we do encourage you to participate in the session by asking questions to the presenter. You can do so by using the box of the Zoom chat. We also encourage questions during the presentation, and there will be a formal Q&A at the end of this session. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can expect a copy of the recording in the coming days. And now I'd like to hand the virtual mic over to Provost Valerie Senatori to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Ada. And behalf on Global Ed and our Chancellor, Dr. Christine Johnson, it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome to the Community Colleges of Spokane, the Honorable Ryan Crocker, Career Ambassador of the Foreign Service of the United States of America. Mr. Crocker currently serves as a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Among other academic appointments are diplomat in residence at Princeton University, inaugural Kissinger Senior Fellow at Yale University, the James Schlesinger Distinguished Visiting Professor post at the University of Virginia, and he additionally served as the Dean of the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University. As a career Foreign Service officer, he has served 6 times as a United States ambassador with posts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Lebanon. He has received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, our nation's highest honor, in 2009, and more recently, he has received the inaugural Bancroft Award presented by the Naval Academy in 2016. In that same year, he was named an honorary fellow of the Literary and Historical Society at University College Dublin, as well as the annual James Joyce Award that year. In October of last year, the West Point Association of Graduates presented him the Thayer Award, whose previous recipients include Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice. He has also been recognized as an honorary Marine. And that is just the smallest introduction that we wanted to provide so as not to cut into our time with the Honorable Mr. Crocker. And at this time, it is my absolute honor to turn the microphone over to him to share his thoughts with us.
Well, thank you, Provost Senatori. I'm really pleased to be with you today, even just virtually. I come to you live from the Spokane Valley, which is where I was born and where I always knew I would one day return. I'm excited about this opportunity. I'm a great admirer of the Spokane Community College system. You've got a terrific chancellor, you have a terrific provost, and you have almost a unique opportunity and asset through Dean Estrada and her operation involving global education. Education truly is global, and the students who are tuning in, I just would want to say to you, this international focus that the college system brings to you is one of the great assets of your education. Not all of the world sees things the same way we do, and the chance to get exposed to other perceptions and viewpoints in and out of classroom settings, I think can be enormously valuable to you. In my own education, I had a year abroad at University College Dublin, and that was truly for me a life-changing experience. Some of you will be fortunate enough to do something similar, but all of you should have the opportunity to get to know some of your fellow students who are from abroad and get a chance to see how they view the world and what they think about it. We may not like it, but it is a globalized society. What happens, for example, in the Middle East, where I spent most of my career, does not exactly stay in the Middle East. So it is good to be aware of the world around you. Higher education is on my mind today in a slightly different context, and indeed it is education generally. Those of you who follow international events may be aware that President Biden a few weeks ago announced his intention to withdraw all US forces from Afghanistan after 20 years since 9/11. I had the privilege as a Foreign Service officer after 9/11 to go out and reopen our embassy in Kabul after the defeat of the Taliban. It was a pretty grim place, Afghanistan, after decades of war. Nothing grew coming in from the airfield at Bagram north of Kabul. All you saw were destroyed habitations and fields of mud. And as we look to our future, and as we look toward a long-term stable Afghanistan that could never again generate attacks such as happened on 9/11, we look short, medium, and long term. Some of our initiatives really encompassed all three of those. And the most important one was education. When I arrived in Afghanistan that early January of 2002, there were about 800,000 to 900,000 students countrywide, country of 25 million people, in school, and all of them were boys. So one of our very first initiatives was to start opening girls' schools. And our thinking behind this was not a nice thing to do. Let's give these poor little kids a chance at a better life. It was part of our whole national security strategy that an educated population, both halves of a population, in an environment of free information and free media would be the best possible defense against an Afghanistan that could ever again try to harm us in our own country. So yes, it was nice to see happy little kids going to school, but behind that was a pretty strong national security argument that I supported. One of our first visitors was then Senator Joe Biden. He was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time. Came out, spent about 3 days with us, which is unusual. Most senior politicians don't want to be out of Washington that long, but he did. And I actually took him to visit a first grade class in a girls' school that we had just opened. And you had girls age 6 to age 12 in this one classroom, because the 12-year-olds became of school age when the Taliban took over the country and ended all education for females. And I remember how struck he was by what he was seeing and how enthusiastic he was. Well, that was then, and this is now. And with the president's decision to pull us all the way out of Afghanistan, we are sadly, I think, leaving these young girls and women to a very uncertain future. And we saw just this last Saturday the horrific bombing of a girls' school in Kabul, killing about 24 young students. An act of savagery, but in my view, one that is calculated to tell the departing Americans and their European allies, and to tell the people of Afghanistan, there's a new sheriff on this block, and it isn't going to be the same. So I worry greatly about what is going to happen to the females, girls, and women in Afghanistan that we urge to step forward, telling them that we had their backs, because we don't have their backs anymore. And I worry that they're going to pay a fearful price as we exit the country, and the forces that we and they have stood against try to seize power through the barrel of a gun. That's primary education. It's not higher education. So let me just make a couple of points on higher education in difficult parts of the world. One other thing that we did early on in Afghanistan was to support the foundation of a private university that would follow an American curriculum, the American University of Afghanistan. We did the same thing in Iraq, where I was ambassador in the the late 2000s. We supported the creation of a private American curriculum university in northern Iraq, and we supported as well the refurbishment and expansion of other universities in Iraq. A few years ago, I was back in Iraq, and I wanted to kind of talk to some of these, university students or recent graduates. These now would be young people who had no personal memory pre-2003 of what it was like under the regime of Saddam Hussein. So I was staying at the Prime Minister's guest house in Baghdad, and about 10 students came over, and all I had to do was say, "So what's on your mind?" I didn't have to say another word because they had a lot on their minds. A predominant theme was their concern over corruption in government. And one young student was speaking with real passion about the impact of corruption on his own future. Living under a predatory government. He said sweepingly that they're all corrupt. It starts with the local policeman, and it goes all the way up through the prime minister, who, by God, is personally corrupt. Well, I'd been in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, 78 to 80. It was a fearful police state. And I said, so, okay, you know where you are. You're a guest of the prime minister here. You're sipping his tea and so forth, and you've just called him a totally corrupt individual. And the kid looks at me and says, "Yeah, it's true. So what?" That was music to my ears. I mean, here was a young man who felt able to say something like that and not fear for his life as a consequence. I mean, that would not have happened if Saddam Hussein was running the show, and it simply reinforced with me, and I had similar conversations in Afghanistan as well, that, boy, the long-term future rests with these young people who see it as their right to speak truth to power. I worry very much in Iraq and in Afghanistan that as we pull back the forces of repression and autocracy are going to be moving in at a cost, again, to the future of these countries, but also our own future in a national security context. Let me say just a word or two about, again, who I am as a Foreign Service officer. Most most Americans are not really aware that they have a foreign service, let alone what it does. So if you were kind of looking at each other when the provost made her kind introductions, and so who is this guy again? Well, we're the ones who operate embassies abroad, looking after US interests around the world, quite literally. Like the military services, we are apolitical. In my own experience, I served again as an ambassador. That's the personal representative of the President of the United States, 6 times, 3 times for Democratic administrations and 3 times for Republican administrations. Another feature of the Foreign Service, it's an inherently dangerous profession. This is an area here in Eastern Washington where residents are proud to serve. We have, a lot of our young people do go into the military, and I would imagine some of you students that are listening to this have already returned as veterans and are using your GI benefits to get a super education at Spokane Community College. Wars get people killed. In the case of the Foreign Service, three of my predecessors as American ambassadors were killed at post in the line of duty in Pakistan, in Lebanon, and in Afghanistan. The loss of life among ambassadors is higher than that among general officers in the U.S. military. So if you're looking for some excitement and some real danger, in addition, you can certainly join the Marines. I became an honorary Marine, but you can also join the Foreign Service. There's no end to the opportunities to live an exciting life, to say the least. What is diplomacy and how does it make a difference? Well, I would give you one example from West Point. As the provost noted, I was the 2020 recipient of the Thayer Award, named after the officer who founded West Point at the beginning of the 19th century. One other Foreign Service officer received that award. That was an individual named Robert Murphy. And he got it for his service way back in World War II. He was political advisor to Dwight Eisenhower. He was a fluent French speaker. He had been at the American Embassy in Paris when the Nazis rolled through, relocated to Marseille, and at the request of General Eisenhower, then moved over to North Africa. And his mission in the early 1940s was to negotiate with the Free French Army in North Africa, which was not subject to the surrender terms that the Nazis imposed on the French army on the European continent. They were outside of that agreement and therefore free to take whatever actions their commanders saw fit. So Ambassador Murphy, at Eisenhower's request, through laborious negotiations, got the Free French leadership to agree that they would support a US-led campaign in North Africa that would move west to east and would drive the Nazis out of Africa, out of North Africa, and prevent them from having control of the Mediterranean Sea. It was Operation Torch. It took place in 1943, and it succeeded. You can read about it in a history book. It sounds kind of like, preordained. Of course it succeeded. But it could have gone bad so many different ways. The French could have refused to join us at the last minute. Weather could have turned bad as we were making the landing in Morocco. Those bad things didn't happen. And the abilities of Ambassador Murphy to bring the French on side and keep them there resulted in our first major victory of World War II. Had Operation Torch failed, there might never have been an Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings in 1944. It literally changed the balance of the war. And it was done, again, not by a uniformed military officer. It was done by a pipe-smoking diplomat. Now, I didn't get to win World War II, but I certainly had some interesting moments in places like Iraq and Afghanistan that I felt really made a difference in life. So what I'd like to do now is just kind of take a look at America and the world and lay out for you my sense that we're at one of those hinge points in history when the world is changing in some fundamental ways. And I'm here to tell you that that those of you who are students here are going to have a really interesting experience standing at this historical pivot point. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'll take you back in history a bit, back to over a little over 100 years. We've been marking the commemoration of World War I and its various historic moments up through the Versailles Agreement of 1919. And you know, the one nice thing about doing this virtually is that I cannot see you stifling that yawn and rolling your eyes as you ask yourselves, oh dear God, why do we have to go through ancient history? Well, the provost and I were talking about this a little before we came on. History is pretty darn important. If you don't know the past, you're going to have a whole lot of trouble dealing with the present and certainly with shaping the future. So what about World War I that made it important? Well, in the first case, it was an accidental war. Nobody really wanted it to happen. There were, though, a series of alliances and counter alliances that shaped and reshaped themselves, that states moved in, states moved out. It was called the balance of power system, and in a sense it was. But by the second decade of the last century, it was getting pretty shaky, that balance of power. So shaky that when a relatively obscure member of the Habsburg ruling family of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated in what was then the even more obscure town of Sarajevo, that was the fuse that lit the bomb of the First World War. And country after country, everybody was in it, drug in by one alliance or another. Nobody had really wanted it, and nobody expected it would last very long. We'll all be home by Christmas was the slogan of August 1914. Well, the survivors were home for Christmas in 1918. It was a horrific conflict in terms of loss of human life, watched from the other side of the Atlantic by President Woodrow Wilson, who saw both the horror of the moment, but also an opportunity for the future. This was a time when he devised his 14 points, which are worth a look at today. He was very farsighted in many respects, and this was one of them. What the world could look like after peace was finally established in Europe with a kind of an insufferable European arrogance. It was called the First World War, even though it only involved Europe. So he came to Versailles where the peace negotiations were taking place, full of hope and full of ideas, didn't quite work out the way he wanted. The dominant European powers on the winning side were Britain and France, and they had some ideas of their own about what the world should look like now that the guns were silent. And it didn't involve national self-determination and the rule of law. It involved empire building, and basically the Europeans, the French and the British, had already divided up the world, and in particular the former Middle East components of the Ottoman Empire, which had joined Germany and the Austro-Hungarians and went down to defeat. So in 1916, in the middle of the war, the British and the French had already devised how they would split the Middle East, for example, into their respective sphere of influences. And again, it did not involve us. One of President Wilson's other great ideas was the creation of the League of Nations as an international body that would serve to prevent the outbreak of mass conflict, such as we had just seen with World War I. That didn't go so well either. The League was indeed formed, but the United States never joined. In the 1918 congressional elections, an isolationist Senate was returned that refused to ratify American participation. So what difference did that make? Well, what it meant was that the United States simply did not have a role to play in the post-World War I order. And that was fine with most Americans. Foreign conflicts, don't go there, stay out of it. And we did, and we stayed out of the peace as well. So what did you get? Well, you got basically a 20-year truce between two halves of a horrific World War. That's all it was. I mean, 1919 to 1939, exactly 2 decades. And the world blew up again as a balance of power system once again became unbalanced. So what did we get after World War II? A fundamentally different approach by the United States. Roosevelt and Truman had studied their history. They knew what happened and didn't happen after the First World War. And Roosevelt was determined as president to ensure that it was quite different the second time around. So the United States hosted, for example, the San Francisco conference. That also during the war, still going on. That created the United Nations, the revised version of the old and unsuccessful League of Nations. We hosted the Bretton Woods Agreement in New Hampshire that recreated the international financial system and moved the world from the gold standard to the dollar standard, and very intentional. We were the force behind NATO a few years later, and the list went on. Not only did we serve as the catalyst for these new international institutions, we were resolved to lead them as well. There would be post-World War II an era of American ascendancy globally, around the world. Not American dictatorship or domination, but American leadership to ensure that the catastrophic international order that precipitated these 2 world wars would not have the opportunity to do so again. And by and large, it worked. We certainly had some conflicts along the way. Vietnam comes to mind, most notably, Korea before that, but they were contained. They did not light that global fuse again, as had happened twice before. And it continued that way for decades. kind of an article of faith among both Republican and Democratic presidents, that American leadership meant taking a stand on key issues of ensuring that, broadly speaking, stability was assured moving forward. It led again in the immediate aftermath of World War II to some interesting developments. You know, one of them would have been February 1945, 2 years before the end of the war. Franklin Roosevelt, already ill, and indeed he would be dead 2 months later, took the long, difficult journey out to the Middle East to meet on board a US destroyer in the Great Bitter Lake outside the Suez Canal with the ruler of Saudi Arabia. Fabulous picture in the archives of this very traditional Arabian monarch and his entourage sitting on blankets laid across the aft deck of a destroyer. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And what that picture basically said was that in the Middle East, the new order would involve oil for security, Saudi oil for American security. And that's exactly what happened. President Roosevelt knew as he was leaving the stage that cementing these long-term relationships were going to be critical for economic development as well as political peace, and did everything he could in those final months of his life to lay down that structure. And again, by and large, it worked. Not perfectly, not always, but there was no new global conflict. The balance of terror might have had something to do with that, of course, because unlike after World War I, nuclear weapons were in the hands of several countries at the end of World War II. So the stakes got much higher. But the basic dynamic didn't really change. Again, different presidents had different agendas, different points of emphasis, but they all agreed that American leadership was an imperative. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the East Bloc, it didn't really change the fundamental dynamic. It just made it more complicated. For all the horror of or potential horror of the Cold War, of the Soviet Union versus the United States, that could, if it went too far out of whack, produce a thermonuclear global disaster. When I was in elementary school, we used to practice these little civil defense drills, like as first graders, where the alarm would go off and we'd get under our desks. And even as a first grader, I was thinking, I don't really think getting under my desk is going to help me a lot if someone drops the big bomb. So that atmosphere of fear was there. But we were, again, able to steer our way through it, both before and after the Soviet Union. President Clinton dealt with these issues as his predecessors and successors would. During his administration, the Balkans blew up. Christians against Muslims, it was split all kinds of different ways. But it was a pretty brutal fight. President Clinton took the view that, look, this is happening in Europe. It isn't part of the Cold War. That's over. It's a European crisis, and the Europeans need to fix it. Could not argue with that logic. But the problem was the Europeans couldn't fix it. And it took the horror of the Srebrenica massacre, when several thousand Muslim men and boys were summarily executed under the eyes of a United Nations peacekeeping contingent. that brought the United States into the process. And a couple of years later, we had the Dayton Accords, bringing an end to that vicious European conflict. Dayton, would that be Dayton, France? No, it was Dayton, Ohio, because only the Americans could do it. The Europeans tried, the Europeans failed. The world does not run by itself. So moving up into the modern era, what do we see? Well, when President Obama was elected, took office, of course, in 2008. Elected in 2008, took office January 2009. He had a different worldview that summarized very broadly as that we need to spend more time worried about problems here at home. He talked about our so-called allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. He talked about the free riders in NATO who got US security but didn't pay the costs of it. With a different kind of language than we had heard from American presidents before. He was not as globally focused and engaged as really all of his predecessors had been. For example, again, looking at the area I knew, the Middle East, not so interested there. And as the civil war in Syria blew up, and we saw thousands of panicked civilians fleeing the conflict and trying to get across the Mediterranean to safety, not his problem. That would be a Middle East problem or a European problem. It wasn't an American problem, and he was pretty clear it wasn't going to become one on his watch. So as we had moved after World War II to make that refugee crisis an American project, not this time around. And a lot of refugees drowned trying to cross the Mediterranean, even though we had a fleet, a US Navy fleet there, the Sixth Fleet, that could have sailed to their rescue. We didn't want to deal with it, and we didn't want to deal with the responsibilities. If we were rescuing a whole bunch of people, then what? At the same time, he was still internationally focused. He concluded a number of significant agreements during his time in office, the Paris Climate Accords, the nuclear agreement with Iran, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership that basically produced a largely economically focused agreement, but also with security components that included almost all the states of East Asia, plus the United States, and did not include China. A Seventh Fleet commander at the time was at a conversation in Arizona hosted by Senator McCain. He was challenged on stage saying that you've been quoted as saying that the Trans-Pacific Partnership in security terms is worth a whole aircraft carrier battle group. The admiral said, I was misquoted. I said it was worth 2 carrier battle groups. So to that extent, President Obama was very much an internationalist. President Trump definitely was not. Those agreements I just mentioned, he canceled all of them, all 3. His view, very similar to what one heard back in the aftermath of the First World War. These are not our problems. We are going to look after our own issues here at home. We are not going to go down these roads and these rat holes and risk our blood and our treasure for other people's problems. Now with President Biden, we have a swing back. President Biden is an internationalist of the old order, and really considerably more so than was President Obama. I mean, this is as his campaign made clear right after the election, this is not Obama 3, it's Biden 1. And he would look at things in a different light. And he has. Again, it was Secretary Blinken who used and reused that phrase, the world won't run by itself. We're going to restore, reinvigorate our traditional alliances because it's important to our own security. Very much traditionalist, and that is why, for me at least, bringing this back around the cycle, the president's decision to completely disengage militarily from Afghanistan is such a disappointment, and quite frankly, something of a fear. So that's the stage I wanted to set for you, quite literally. You will be the ones, you students, who are going to have to find ways to deal with these complex issues and to deal with the fundamental issue of the role for America in the world. Are we one among many, more powerful than most? Or are we determined to lead again, to lead, not to dominate and not to dictate, but to lead in the world in the same spirit that FDR brought to that task right after World War II? And the debate you will be part of, whether you want to or not, what do we do and with what consequences? I very much hope that as you look at the world and as you look at your role in our society, but also globally, that you weigh the consequences carefully and that you question our leaders directly and clearly. Because I would suggest what you do not want to do is see the world return to its balance of power default position, and remember the history of what that position brought and what it cost. So with that, I turn it back to you and hopefully to some really good questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Honorable Ryan. I invite the audience now to ask questions. You can unmute yourself and ask questions directly, or enter your questions in the chat here on Zoom.
I'll start with the question, Ryan, if that's okay. So in the past few days, we've been hearing a lot in the news about what's going on in Israel, Jerusalem, Gaza. In light of what you just talked about and how that the US staying out of conflicts that don't seem to be any of our business has not worked. And sometimes stepping in is what needs to be done. Can you tell me what you think, in light of that conflict, the role of the US should be?
Well, that's a great question, because, you know, here we have it. I've laid out the theory and we've got the practical test right before our eyes. So yes, what it for me at least, the violence of the past few days reverberates on a number of levels. First, that the Arab-Israeli conflict is not over, in spite of the 3 peace agreements negotiated under the Trump administration that brought formal peace to Israel and some of its fellow states in the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. Positive steps, certainly, but the fundamental core issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is still very much there. Is this a core US concern? You know, it almost always has been, and that was because of our strong ties to Israel coming out of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust. We have consistently involved ourselves and intervened in efforts to bring peace, or at least in efforts to prevent broader war. So it's a great question and a great issue to focus on, to see what the Biden administration does. The Trump administration, very disinclined to get involved in these things, although in fairness, there wasn't a lot to be involved in, or we did not have a major violence of outbreak of Arab-Israeli violence on his watch. Now the Biden administration faces it, so we will see. Will they send out a senior envoy to talk to the Israelis, to talk to Palestinians, to try to lower the temperature and end the violence, or will they just let it ride and hope that we don't see this develop into a larger conflict? So it is a test, if you will, of this administration. We will see what they do. And if they do launch an initiative, send an envoy, that will be very much in the tradition of past US presidents and other senior American leaders that go back to the 1967 war. If they don't, fasten your seatbelt. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question here. Being an ambassador to Pakistan from 2004 to 2007, how much do you believe the Pakistani government purposely assists the Taliban with financial and military aid and turns a blind eye to terrorists like Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri residing in their country?
Again, it's another great question, and on a number of levels and dimensions. One of the issues that I encountered when I was in Afghanistan as ambassador was that our military commanders didn't have a lot of knowledge of or experience with Pakistan. We did not have deployed forces there. So they knew the Afghan side of it very well, not so much the Pakistan side. And this is again where history comes into play. You know, I had the benefit of 3 years as ambassador to Pakistan, and then of course going over to be ambassador to Afghanistan. So I could understand both narratives. So here's the Pakistani narrative on Pakistan and the Taliban. And it goes like this, that during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s, almost a decade, the US and Pakistan were very closely allied in trying to defeat the Soviets. The anti-Soviet jihad was staged out of Pakistan's northwest frontier. We provided the training, the Gulf states provided the financing, and working together, we defeated the Soviet Union. They made a total withdrawal in 1989. And that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union for one consequence. But we decided we were done too. And we were there as a function of the Cold War. With the Soviets defeated, we no longer had any reason to be there. And we would pull out. We didn't have deployed forces, but we did have a significant security effort going on. And we could see that after the Soviet withdrawal, there would be a really big, bad civil war in Afghanistan, because the only thing that united the various Afghan factions was a common enemy, the Soviets. Take that away, and they would turn on each other. Very predictable, but not our problem. We said at the time, and that is, of course, what happened. Now, on the way out, we stopped getting congressional waivers for assistance to Pakistan. Congress had passed a bill some years before that required the complete cessation of military and economic aid for any country pursuing a nuclear weapons program. The Pakistanis had publicly made it clear that's exactly what they were doing, because the Indians were doing the same thing. So each year through the 80s, we got a waiver, a national security waiver. After the defeat of the Soviet, we didn't need Pakistan anymore. We stopped getting the waivers. And they basically fell under US sanctions that blocked all assistance to them, military and civilian, with a horrendous civil war on their borders. Again, this is their narrative and it can be challenged. But fast forward to post 9/11, when we needed them again, they were only too happy to work with us and accept whatever aid they could get. But they were also pretty clear to me that that given their experience with us in the past, that if we really thought they were going to turn the Afghan Taliban into a mortal enemy, the Taliban that was present in Pakistan after they had to flee Afghanistan, we thought that we would ask Pakistan to, again, turn them into an enemy at our request. They said to me, "That's nuts, you're crazy. We know what you did the last time. You got tired, you felt your work was done, and you left. And that's what you're going to do this time. We don't know when, but we know you're going to do it because that's what you always do. You lose patience. You move on to something else. You won't stay for the long fight." And sadly, again, what President Biden has decided completely vindicates that line of argument. The Taliban will be back, and the Pakistanis, I think, are quite relieved that they didn't, at our request, turn against the Taliban. Now, that, again, it's a Pakistani narrative, and it certainly can be challenged. But my point here is, there are no clear black and white choices in national security policies. It's shades of gray that you've got to sift your way through. What are your least worst options? And again, the importance of knowing how the world looks and how the United States looks through eyes that are not American. And that was the perspective I could bring when I was ambassador to Afghanistan. Do I condone what the Pakistani government is doing that was getting our troopers killed? No, it made me mad too, really mad. But I understood why they were doing it. And that the only way they would not continue to do it would to be for them to be absolutely certain we were there for the indefinite future, whatever it took. Now we've seen, of course, that in fact, there is kind of congruity between the Trump and Biden administrations. Nobody ever really thought that on a key national security issue. Unfortunately, they both are making the same mistake, disengage from Afghanistan, with, again, significant consequences for our own security, as well as the future of our relationships in that region.
Thank you. We have one question from Ping Ping. To maintain US #1 superpower status in the world, do you see militarism and colonization of the world is still the answer? Is it a wise path to always wanting to be the superpower?
Well, again, that encapsulates everything we've been talking about here. What is the proper role for the United States in the world going forward? And we need a long, strong, and healthy debate on just that. There is a lot of talk out there about the militarization of American foreign policy. In my experience working with military leaders in the crunchier part of the region, it isn't quite that way. Those of you who have served and hope to serve already know this. The most anti-war components of society are those who have to go out and fight it. Too often we have defaulted to the military to basically say, let's send in the troops. We can't think of anything else to do. Well, the troops and those who command them would like to see it very differently. Use diplomacy first. And I found in my time, again, in these crunchy places, our field commanders only too ready to get counsel from senior civilians, senior diplomats such as myself, and to use the awesome powers we have in a way that facilitates a political solution, not detracts from it. So no, we don't need to be the world's occupier. We couldn't if we did want. What we do need to do is bring the famous three Ds into greater harmony and balance, that being defense, diplomacy, and development. And in my time in both Iraq and Afghanistan, our military wanted to see more USAID officers that they could work with. They had the money. USAID had the development experience. You combine the two. So the answer, I think, is not either or. It's a blend that we use our military and its capabilities in a manner that supports rather than tries to replace diplomacy and development. All of that said, there is a saying that I was quite fond of when I was ambassador to Kuwait in the 90s. A United States aircraft carrier it's 100,000 tons of diplomacy. When you have a stick that big, you get people's attention, and you don't need to use it to get the changes you may need. You have to be ready to, but I've always been very comfortable working with military counterparts. It's just an issue of coordination.
Thank you so much, Ryan. We have, I think, time for one last question before we close the session. And the question here would be, would you encourage young people to go into the foreign department, to the State Department and Foreign Service?
Absolutely. So I'm from here, went to college down the road at Whitman and Walla Walla. I knew what the Foreign Service was because my dad had been a career Air Force officer, and we were stationed abroad several times, including my last couple of years of high school. So I knew that there was a Foreign Service. And then I figured out how you could apply to join it. And it's really easy. There is two requirements. You have to be an American citizen, born or naturalized, and you have to be 21 years of age. That's it. The selection process is by competitive examination. It is given roughly 3 times a year, and it is given here in Spokane. So if you're interested, and you all should be, visit the world before the world visits you. Just go to state.gov and follow the links for the Foreign Service exam application. There is no education requirement. A colleague of mine, now retired, a very good, accomplished Foreign Service officer, not only did he not have a college education, he didn't even have a high school diploma. He'd lied about his age, joined the Marines at age 17, then got interested in the Foreign Service and went through the process and was appointed. He did eventually get his GED, but that was it. So, it's Foreign Service needs to look like America, especially the parts of America like us that are in what they call flyover country, not either coast. So by all means, just remember that state.gov Foreign Service exam. You too can go out among people who are even more heavily armed than we are here in Eastern Washington and have all kinds of fascinating experiences.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate having you today. I continue to be inspired by your work. And I just want to, on behalf of CCS and our committee, to thank you for sharing your professional experiences and expertise with our community today. It's sincerely an honor. And I would like also to thank our audience for your time and participation, and all of you who have sponsored the event today, Provost Senatore, President Messina, and also the concierge work of our intercultural committee. Thank you so much. And I'll give you the last departing words and thoughts. Ryan, if you want to share anything before we leave the session today.
To reiterate my opening points, those of you who are students, you are incredibly lucky to be getting your education at the community colleges of Spokane. This is the system here is one of the finest in the nation, and we see it with what we've just been through. Not a lot of community colleges have a dean of global engagement, and what I've tried to do is say the opportunities you have to learn about the world are present on your campuses and with your fellow students who are from abroad. Take full advantage of them, because the world is not going away. We don't live in it alone, and getting those perspectives is a unique opportunity that you have in this great community college system.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much again, everyone. Thank you, Ryan. We hope to see you again.
I look forward to it in person the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.